Okay, and here we go. So this class is called Helpful Habitat for Pollinators. We're going to be talking about pollinators of a few different kinds, native bees, butterflies, and hummingbirds, kind of some of the most popular ones. And things that you can do in your landscape to make a good habitat for them, to attract them, and to bring them into your yard and to help them. Really, this is helping them and you. So let's just start out really quickly. What is pollination? This is an elementary school graphic, but I just love it because it's so simple and it just describes pollination, just the basics. So very basically, pollination, it occurs starting on one part of the flower called the anther, which is the part that makes pollen. A bee or a butterfly or some animal visits the flower, touches the anther, gets pollen on their body, and travels to another flower. And the pollen's goal is to make it to the pistil, which is the flower part that will lead to the egg. So that's how we fertilize the flower. That's how it makes seeds and fruit and continues to survive for future generations. And that is kind of pollination in a very, very general nutshell. I would guess that you're all on this call because you are interested in pollinators and you care about them. But, you know, let's talk a little bit about why they're so important. They are extremely important. 75% of all flowering plants in the world need the help of an animal pollinator. They cannot survive and reproduce without some type of animal. And that does include 75% of food crops. So for us to continue to eat, we need them. Now, about 1,000 of these pollinator species are birds, bats, and small mammals, but 200,000 are insects. So bees, flies, beetles, moths, butterflies. So definitely insects are doing the majority of the pollinating, but there definitely are some other kinds of species that do pollinate certain kinds of flowers. Like I said, without pollinators, most plants in the world would not be able to produce seeds or fruit, which would be catastrophic to the food chain and everything in the way our ecosystems work. A third of the food and beverages produced in the U.S. need pollinators for them to be produced in agriculture. So things like apples, blueberries, squash, almonds, chocolate, coffee. I mean, chocolate and coffee, that's reason enough right there for me to want to protect pollinators. I need those two things. Maybe money speaks to you a little bit more. So pollinators actually help to produce $20 billion worth of products just in the US. That is a ton of money into our economy that wouldn't be there without the help of pollinators. Now here's the scary part. You know, we will talk a little bit about some of the bad, scary things that are happening with pollinators, and mainly that is that a lot of the populations are declining. This is due to a lot of factors. We really can't narrow it down to one thing, but disease, increasing use of herbicides and pesticides in incorrect manners, habitat destruction, loss of floral abundance, so the amount of flowers they need and the diversity of flowers they need. These are all some of the big contributing factors to why a lot of pollinator species do have declining populations. But people like you who are interested in learning about what you can do to help, this is what it's going to take to help them to recover. So I'm so glad that you're all here. We're going to start out talking about native bees. I'm not really going to touch on honeybees. Honeybees are actually an introduced species. I'm going to be talking about native bees, and these are bees that are native to Colorado, or the specific species that I'll go over. But you all have native bees in your home states, and a lot of them are going to nest in the exact same ways of the ones that we have in Colorado. So this can definitely be applied in wherever you're at. So why should we conserve native bees? Why are they important? Well, native bees have co-evolved with native plants and native crops, and they're much more efficient pollinators for those native plants than an introduced bee like a honeybee is. Without native bees, many of our native plants would probably go extinct. And like I said, these plants are a part of a food chain, they're a part of an ecosystem. So that would be very catastrophic if we start to lose our native plants because of losing our native bees. Native bees often look, native bees often are small and they're overlooked because they don't, a lot of them, most of them are solitary. So they don't have these big swarming hives that we see with a honeybee. They, they're solitary, they nest in the ground and in things like that. So they're often overlooked. And some of them are so small, you might not notice they're a bee at all. You might think that they're a fly or some other kind of insect. So it is good to just kind of spread awareness that there are these little types of bees around. Here's some of our native bees on the right here. We have a big, beautiful, fluffy bumblebee, a sweat bee, which are some of the ones that are definitely overlooked because they're very small, a lot of the sweat bees, but they're that shiny green. So next time you see that, you can kind of be aware that that's a sweat bee. And then the alkali bee, which we will talk about in a little bit more detail. Another reason why it's so good to conserve native bees in your area is that, if you just have one species of bee and then a disease comes that wipes out that entire species, you're left with no pollinators. So if we have a diverse range of different species of bees, that kind of spreads the risk out that they're not all going to get wiped out. Now, since 1950, there has been a 50% decline in managed beehives. Although, with the increased awareness that has been going on in recent years, this number is starting to be on the rise. And like I said, that's because of people like you who care. So thank you for that. Now, since 1950, the bee populations have declined by 50%, but the amount of acreage of cropland that needs pollinated has doubled. So we need a lot more pollinators to pollinate this cropland to keep the world fed. As far as wild hives go, not managed hives, but just the wild hives, there has been a 70 to 100% decline. Some species of, in particular, bumblebees are now extinct. So this is definitely something that we need to address before the situation gets out of our control. Like I did mention the bumblebees, there are many native bumblebees, such as the yellow-banded bumblebee, Franklin's bumblebee, and the rusty patch bumblebee, and the western bumblebee, which you can see some photos here on the right. They are imperiled to the point that they are on the brink of extinction. So these are definitely species that have been, the Xerces Society has been really pushing to protect. As far as native bees goes, about 7%, a little over 7% of all the native bees have a declining population. 12.6 are stable, so that's good. Some are stable, and a little over 0.5% are increasing. But for the other 79%, there's just not enough data to say. A lot of times, the native bees aren't really the topic of research studies and things like that, so we just don't really know. But like I said, spreading awareness, being aware that they're there, trying to help them out, that will help to boost those populations. So let's talk about a little bit about what a bee looks like, the anatomy of the bee. So very generally, they have 3 body regions: the head, the thorax in the middle, and the abdomen is kind of the back area. They have antennae that are used to touch and to smell. They have 2 compound eyes and 3 simple eyes. So their eyes are very different than ours are. A lot of the native bees have very strong and very developed mandibles, which are mouth parts that are used for biting and digging and making nests. And we'll talk more about how they do that. The thorax, the middle region, has 2 pairs of wings. So that's a good indicator of sometimes like what's a bee and what's a fly or another kind of insect is bees have 2 pairs of wings that are fused and 3 pairs of legs. The abdomen is the back end. On bumblebees, that's where you'll see their big, beautiful wax glands. And females will, of course, have their stingers on the abdomen, and then there are usually some kind of hairs to help with pollen collection. There are long-tongued bees and short-tongued bees, and this a lot of times determines which flowers they will visit. A short-tongued bee isn't going to visit a flower that has a very long tubular shape. They won't be able to reach any nectar or anything like that. So that would be a flower that a long-tongued bee might visit. So that kind of matters when it comes to where they will go as far as flowers. And native bees are absolutely pollinators. There is one species of the leafcutter bee, Megachile rotunda is its Latin name, that farmers will actually cultivate and raise this bee to help pollinate their alfalfa because they've been found to be more efficient at it than honeybees. So what the farmers do is they have these pre-drilled boards that you'll see in the photo. The bees will nest in those pre-drilled cavities. At the end of the season, the farmers will store the boards and bring them out at the beginning of the next season and release the young bees so that they will pollinate their alfalfa fields. So that's kind of a different beekeeping strategy, other than very different than honeybees anyway. Bumblebees are excellent crop pollinators. They're actually even more efficient than honeybees for blueberries, cranberries, melons, and even more different crops. They're so big and they buzz so hard that they do a really good job at disrupting that pollen and pollinating those plants. Speaking of bumblebees and their incredible buzzing, they do something called buzz pollination. So if you are a vegetable gardener, you might know that tomatoes and peppers don't necessarily need a pollinator. They can pollinate themselves. They have the anther and the pistil in one flower. But if a bumblebee comes along and visits that tomato flower, like in the picture, they will buzz so hard on that flower that it will shake the pollen loose, and it increases yields in a vegetable garden a lot. And, you know, even if they don't necessarily need a pollinator, the pollinator is still very, very helpful when it comes to helping that pollen reach where it needs to be. And like I mentioned already, many of our native plants are only pollinated by native bees. So those plants absolutely need a pollinator, and they need a specific pollinator in a lot of circumstances. So let's talk a little bit about our native bees that we have in Colorado. In Colorado, there are 950 species of bee that can be found. Not all of those are native, but boy, that's a lot of species of bees. They have a wide variety of sizes. The smallest bee that we have is Perdita minima, and the largest bee is a Carpenter Bee. And this picture, which is obviously just a representation, it's not real, but this would be Perdita minima on the head of a Carpenter Bee. So you can see the size difference there is pretty great, and that's pretty interesting. The lifespan of a bee can be just a couple weeks, it can be years, it depends on the species. They all kind of have a different life cycle. Most of our solitary bees here in Colorado are going to overwinter in their nest as larvae, with the adults dying when the temperatures start freezing. So the adults are buzzing around all summer long, building their nests, and you can see a picture here of kind of what that might look like. They lay their egg. The adult will die at that point at the end of the year. This egg overwinters, becomes a larva, becomes a pupa. When springtime comes next year, the bee emerges as an adult to start the cycle all over again. So that's, of course, there are different life cycles for some species, but this is the typical, most common life cycle that we'll see. Let's talk about some specific bees that we have here in Colorado. This bee here is called a plaster bee. It is a ground nester. So they actually will dig holes in the ground and nest in cavities in the ground. They line their nests with a cellophane-like material that they actually secrete from a gland on their body. So they're able to make that And that cellophane-like material is thought to have some antifungal properties, so that it will prevent any kind of fungal growth in the nest over the winter, and that their egg and their larva will be safe. Once the bee digs its cavity, lines it with the cellophane-like material, it'll fill that nest cell with liquid food, nectar, things like that, attaches an egg to the top, and we'll seal it off with that cellophane-like material to protect the egg. There is a type of fly in Colorado that will parasitize plaster bees by getting into the nest cell, laying their egg in there. Their larva will hatch first, eat all the food, and that will leave none for the bee larva, and the bee larva won't survive. So that is naughty. That is not nice to the plaster bee, but that's what they do. That's how they survive. Excuse me. The masked bee looks similar to a wasp, so kind of be careful. You can see it's kind of black and has that face that just looks real wasp-like, but this actually is a bee. They're very small. They have that yellow diamond-shaped marking on their face. Interestingly enough, this species carries their pollen and their nectar internally, whereas most bees will have the pollen stuck to the outside of their bodies, and that makes it easier for researchers to tell which flowers are being visited by these bees. But for the masked bee, it's hard to tell. It's hard to say because the pollen's on the inside. So, we don't want to kill them to see what kind of pollen they have. So we're not too sure what exactly they visit. Now, this bee is a wood nester. They chew cavities in wood, like you can see in this picture here, with their mandibles. And then they will line that nest, again, with a cellophane-like material that they secrete. And these are going to be primarily spring bees. These bees are out in the spring. So it's super important to have early blooming plants, because a lot of these bees are only out early and they need pollen early. This is a miner bee, kind of a cute, fluffy little thing. They're ground nesters as well. Most are dark black or kind of reddish. You can see in this photo here, this one's kind of yellow and red. They can be metallic blue, so their color kind of ranges. They're a larger bee and they're very shy. This is not one that's going to be aggressive or come after you at all. They have a very velvety patch between their eyes. Many are only active in early spring. So again, it's important to have those early blooming pollinator plants for bees like this. Digger bees. Again, the name probably tells you that this bee digs holes, so they're another ground nester. They burrow into the ground with their jaws, the females that is, as they make their nests. They create tunnels. The males have very long antennae and are sometimes called longhorn bees. The nests of a digger bee sometimes have a chimney-like extension at the opening. And they are solitary bees, but they will nest in aggregation. So they'll have their own nest, but you'll often see them nesting kind of in one general area. And the males can actually sense where the females are located underground. So that's kind of interesting. Mason bees. These are a really popular kind of bee for people to raise as well. They're very commonly used in orchards as pollinators. Like I said, people do raise them. There's a lot of mason bee habitats, which I'll show you one at the end that you can make at home. This is definitely a bee that you can put up a habitat for in your yard. They nest in pre-formed cavities. They don't make their own. They don't dig or tunnel through wood. They are looking for a pre-formed cavity of the right diameter to make their nest. So that's where we can kind of help them out, and we'll talk more about that. 2 to 3 female mason bees can completely pollinate a mature apple tree, so they're pretty efficient. And they line their nest with mud, hence the name mason bee, and you can see some of their little mud cavity things on the right there. Leafcutter bees. This is one that at the extension office we sometimes get calls about because they line their nests with pieces of leaves and they cut little circles out of leaves. So sometimes people will say, something's eating my Virginia creeper. They're eating these holes, and it's so obvious once you see the picture. That's a leaf cutter bee. They're these nice, perfect little half circles. They're about the size of a honeybee, a little bit of a different color. They're a little darker. They're not aggressive. Obviously, if you are threatening them, they can sting, but their sting is only mildly painful, so nothing to really worry about. They are solitary. They don't have hives. Adult females only live 2 months, but in that time, they lay 40 eggs in rotting wood or stems of plants. So they're kind of looking for preformed cavities as well. And like I said, they cut about like these 3/4 inch circles out of the edge of the leaves. You might see it particularly on your rose, ash, lilac, and Virginia creeper. It doesn't typically harm the plant. These are solitary bees, so it's not like a whole bunch of them are going to be on your rose and doing that. Maybe just one might take a few circles of leaf to line their cavity, and it doesn't really harm the plant, and it's actually kind of cool to know that you have a leaf cutter bee around. I saw my Virginia creeper had some leaf cutter bee injury the other day, and I was so excited. Sweat bees. We talked about these little tiny shiny things. They're very small, shiny metallic bodies. Most are green, but they also can be blue, copper, gold, or black. So they kind of range. Most nest in the ground. There's different types of sweat bees, but most are ground nesting, and most are solitary, although some will share the entrance to their nest, but once they get underground, they will have separate solitary nests. And they actually will share the duty of guarding that entrance and even of rearing the young. Usually those are sisters that are sharing that responsibility. They're just kind of helping out the family there. An alkali bee is a type of sweat bee that is used commercially. It is raised to pollinate fields, and it gets its name because it likes alkali soil, which is great here in Colorado because we've got that. So the farmers create these beds of soil for the bees to nest in. They protect that area, they help to maintain it, and they can have those little beds active for decades. Usually this is going to be in alfalfa fields. That's what they're usually pollinating. Carpenter bees, this is one of our biggest bees. They are very large. They look like bumblebees, except their upper abdomen isn't quite as hairy. It's more glossy than a bumblebee would be. Males are going to be out courting females in early spring, and they will get a little bit aggressive. They'll definitely chase away other male bees, and sometimes they might go after a human if you get too close to them. But males have no stingers, so don't let them fool you. The females do have very strong mandibles, and they're carpenter bees, so they are using those strong mandibles to cut tunnels into wood to nest in. The female carpenter bee is a bit of a trickster. They will sometimes cut slits in the bottom of flowers and get the nectar out. And if they do it from the bottom of the flower, they're kind of cheating because they're not pollinating the flower. They're not touching all those parts that make pollen and things like that. So we call that nectar robbing because they're stealing the nectar without doing any pollinating. And bumblebees, of course, this is actually not a solitary bee. Bumblebees are social. Some are native to Colorado, and they don't make a typical hive like a honeybee. They make this kind of pot-shaped hive that you see on the right here. They're more active in cool weather and in wet weather. We have 23 species found in Colorado, so a lot of different species of bumblebees. They're large and they're furry. They're hard to miss when one goes by you. Mostly are black. Some have stripes of yellow, white, or orange. They are social. Like I said, their colonies are smaller and they're shorter lived than a honeybee hive would be. Their hives are in the ground most often. And they have much bigger cavities than other ground nesting bees do. I have 2 slides on bumblebees because they're just so neat. So like I said, they build pot-shaped cells out of a wax that they secrete and they make. And the female bumblebee will fill that with pollen and honey. She then lays eggs. The first eggs that she lays are the sterile female workers. Once the sterile female workers hatch, the queen, they're out doing all the work, and the queen is rarely going to leave the nest again. She spends the rest of her days laying eggs. At the end of the season, she lays male eggs, and then more female eggs that will become the new queens. At the end of the season, only the new queens are going to survive, and then they will find a new place to make a new colony and start all over again. And bumblebees actually are kind of neat because they have these big pollen baskets on their hind legs. If you see a bumblebee fly by you, you might see big pollen baskets on them. So let's talk a little bit about habitats. We've kind of ran through it, but we basically have, as far as native bees go, we have bumblebees are our social bees. The rest are solitary, and they either nest in the ground or they nest in wood. Those are kind of the options that we're seeing. Only about 12% of the native bees in Colorado are social. 70% are solitary. So she, just like a bird would, the female builds the nest, cares for it alone. Now there are parasitic bees, most notably the cuckoo bee, and they lay their eggs in the nests of other bees. Some will actually also kill the host larva so that their larva, the parasitic bee larva, will have all the food and all the shelter. So that's kind of their mechanism of how they survive. 70% of the native bees are going to be ground nesters. So ground nesting is more common than wood nesting. And they nest in these really easy to miss holes in the ground. They resemble ant holes, and they're very easy to miss. So that's something to be aware of. So those ground nesters, they need to have access to the soil. They prefer sandy soil. It's easier to work with. They'll usually nest in bare areas or with just very sparse vegetation where they have a lot of access to the soil, in embankments, undisturbed areas. So if you want to encourage them to be in your yard, that's something to think about. Give them an area where they have some undisturbed, exposed soil. Now, 30% of our solitary bees do nest in wood, Carpenter bees being one of them. And Carpenter bees, they have those big, strong mandibles. They will excavate their own tunnels and holes. But others, a lot of others actually, need a preformed cavity, and it has to be of a correct size. Now, it's been found that 5/16 to 3/8 of an inch is the magic number there. That's the size, the diameter of the cavity that they're looking for. So a lot of times they'll nest in burrows made by beetles or the pits of stems of twigs. So they'll get into that wood, they'll line the nest with their material of choice, whether it's mud for a mason bee, leaves for a leafcutter bee, whatever it is. They fill the cells with nectar and pollen, they lay the egg, and they seal the cell. A nest tube might contain dozens of cells with eggs in them. And then the young bees will kind of develop in there and emerge the next season. And you can see the picture in the middle here. You can see the bee larvae starting to form in these cavities. Social bumblebees, they do live in colonies founded by a single queen. Usually those colonies for most species only last one season, and they could contain up to 300 workers. Bumblebees tend to nest in old rodent holes or overgrown areas or under brush piles or grasses, somewhere kind of protected and out of the way. Females, when it's time to rest, are usually going to rest inside the nest, but males will gather in places. So you might see them like in this bottom picture, hanging out together from the stem of a plant, resting in the daytime. So threats to native bees. Of course, there are threats. That's why we're talking about their populations declining. Pesticide use is a big one. People using them unnecessarily, people using them incorrectly on plants that you shouldn't be using them on. These are all harmful things that could really harm the bees. So neonicotinoids are a class of insecticides that are being used more and more on plants, and they're systemic. So that means they actually enter the inside of the plant, which causes them to reside in the pollen and the nectar of those plants. And they can persist over time in the pollen, in the nectar, and in the soil, and they're highly toxic to bees. So that is definitely something that you want to look out for. And even if you are using a pesticide that's certified organic, there are certified organic pesticides that are very toxic to bees, such as pyrethorins and spinosad. You can see on this chart here, it kind of shows you some different pesticides and insecticides and where they rank as far as how toxic they are to bees. Spinosad, you can see here, is an organic pesticide, and it's highly toxic. So just because it's organic doesn't mean it's safe. You still really need to read the label on anything that you use. Make sure you're not using it on a plant you're not supposed to be. Make sure you're not using it on a plant that's going to be visited by bees. There are warnings and there are precautions on the labels of these products. If you find that you need to use one, just please read the label from front to back. Call your local extension office if you need help interpreting that label. We can help you. Insecticidal soaps and horticultural oils are safer if you don't apply them directly to a bee, which I hope nobody would be squirting products on an actual bee, but those do tend to be a little bit safer. Using these products at night or on non-blooming crops makes them even more safe. So like I said, you'll get these slides and you'll have this table that you can kind of check out if you do think you need to use a product, how toxic is this to bees? So pesticides obviously are directly harmful to bees. Herbicides can kind of be indirectly harmful to bees. For one, they can change the plant community. They can reduce forage and habitat. I know a lot of people don't want to see dandelions in their lawn, but bees love dandelions. So if you're spraying herbicides on something like a dandelion, you are getting rid of something that a bee could be foraging on. So overusing herbicides also tends to make weeds come up a little bit more. So that's a thing that to pay attention to. Minimize chemical use as much as possible. If you're trying to make a pollinator-friendly yard, that's step one. We really don't want to, we want to find other ways to handle our problems other than chemicals. If you absolutely need to use something, try to choose the least harmful ingredient, something very targeted with the least impact on the environment. And time your applications to avoid bees. So, bees are usually less active certain times of the day, so read the label. It'll tell you. Even plants that, like I said, we consider weeds, like dandelions and thistle. Bees love them. So just kind of consider that. What's the harm of having a few dandelions in the lawn if the bees like them? There are, of course, a lot of other factors. There are diseases that have been brought in by introduced bees that are not native, that are now starting to affect native bees. There is nutrition stress going on due to native flowers decreasing, people choosing to plant non-native landscapes, and that kind of decreases the plants that they can forage on. Loss of buffer strips and natural spaces, especially near farmland when we don't have those natural areas. There's really nothing for them to forage on. Obviously, urban developments and just habitat loss. These are some of the big threats that native bees are facing. So what do bees eat? What's native bee food? Obviously, nectar and pollen. That's what they eat. The nectar provides carbohydrates. That gives them the energy. And pollen provides protein. Parasitic bees will feed on nectar, but do not collect pollen. They don't usually do a lot of pollinating. And many have actually, over time, evolved to have lost their pollen baskets. And a lot of the parasitic bees actually resemble wasps. And on the bottom here, here's a really good picture of a big, beautiful pollen basket on a bee. That's pretty neat. Now, some bees like bumblebees, they're generalists. They can visit a wide variety of flowers. But other bees are specialists. They can only use pollen from maybe 1 or 2 different plant families. Now, usually they can drink nectar from more varieties of flowers than they can collect pollen from. Nectar is a little bit more general, but a lot of bees can only use pollen from certain plant families. So let's talk about attracting the native bees to your landscape. Of course, it's important to provide food in the form of flowers, and then habitat, which would be sunny, undisturbed ground for our ground nesters, and old wood or snags or stumps for our wood nesters. Plant a pollinator garden. Use native plants from your area. Figure out what grows naturally there and plant those plants. Those are what will be good for the native bees. Obviously, avoid the use of chemicals if at all possible. Provide clean water and mud. Bees will be attracted to that. And you want to try to provide a variety of different plants, and you want to have plants that are blooming all season. So the goal for a really good pollinator garden is to have 3 different varieties of plants that are blooming early, midsummer, and late. That's the big goal. So for the early emerging bees, for those bees that are out late in the season, you want to have something for every bee. And then of course they have all of these, you know, if you go onto Pinterest or whatever, you can search for a bee house or a native bee hotel and find so many cool, inspiring ideas of little like insect hotels that you can make in your yard. And they're really neat looking. They provide habitat, and it's a really great thing to add to your pollinator garden. So like I said, you are getting the slides. I'm just gonna quickly run through these for the sake of time, but you will have this list that you can look at and refer to when it's time to plant your pollinator garden. There's tons. There are tons of plants that you can plant for bees, but I just picked a few to show you. So this is Prairie Smoke, and these are the seed heads. I mean, it looks like something out of Dr. Seuss. I love those. They're so cool. Bumblebees are their main pollinator. Very showy seed pods. I just absolutely love them. Pasque flower is going to be a very early bloomer. Great for those early emerging bees. Let's see. I just love the shape of this flower, and they're just so pretty. And if you see them somewhere early in the spring, they'll be covered in those early emerging pollinators. Blue flax. I will tell you, this is an easy one. I have one of these growing in my yard that I did not plant. It was there when I moved in. I have never watered it. I have never paid 1 ounce of attention to it. It blooms every spring like crazy. So this is easy, very drought tolerant. It'll handle heavy clay soils, which is common. They're common in Colorado. So this is a real easy pollinator plant to grow. Any kind of asters, these are going to usually be later bloomers, even into the fall. Lots of species to choose from. I just love the look of a classic aster. So any that you would find would be good. Yarrow, another great one. Not picky when it comes to soil. It'll take full sun, and I just love this flower as well. Rocky Mountain bee plants. Obviously, it's in the name, right? Full sun. It might need a little bit more moisture than some of the other ones we talked about, but it has a ton of nectar, so the bees will love it. Goldenrod, another late bloomer. It has heavy pollen grains, so this will be visited by some of the bigger species. Like some nice rich soil and full sun. Common sunflower. This is an easy one, right? Everybody can grow a sunflower. This will be like a mid to late bloomer, very drought tolerant. Some of the varieties can get up to 10 feet tall, so they're kind of showstoppers in the garden. Rabbit brush. This is one that is native in Pueblo. If you live in Pueblo, particularly Pueblo West, you've seen rabbit brush for sure. It has these bright yellow flowers in late summer. It also provides habitat, and they do make it in a dwarf variety. It can be pretty large, the normal variety, but they make a dwarf variety that is great, and it can fit better into a smaller garden. So let's do a few fun facts of native bees. Our vegetable gardens need bees to be able to produce a bountiful harvest. Obviously, things like zucchini absolutely need pollinators, but we already talked about peppers and tomatoes being buzz pollinated. That'll increase your yield. And bees actually descended from wasps. Wasps were around first. Wasps are carnivores. So probably the first flowering plants evolved 125 million years ago. There's probably a wasp hunting, accidentally took a drink of nectar, and the rest is evolutionary history. They started to evolve from there and start to feed on more nectar and pollen, and bees evolved from wasps. Most bees around our parts are going to forage during the day when the flowers are open, but in the tropics, there are some species of bees that are strictly nocturnal. They only feed on nectar from nocturnal flowers, and they navigate by moonlight. And that's a picture of one of them. They look kind of funny, like they would be around at night. So that's interesting. And then this is the last thing I wanted to, well, second from last thing. I wanted to show you these mason bee habitats. You can buy the tubes online if you just look, or you can find hollow tubes of the right diameter, and you can kind of shove them into a little container, hang it somewhere in your landscape, and this is a great habitat for mason bees. You remember, they want a pre-formed cavity, so this is great for them to find. They'll be so happy. They'll probably stick around your yard and pollinate your flowers for you. So that's just an idea of a habitat that you can actually make. Here's some references. You will have this, but these are just some extra things that you can check out. And then I'm going to show you for each of these different pollinators a citizen science project. So if you're not familiar with citizen science, these are projects around the country that are, asking for help from just normal people like you and me to get out there, do some monitoring, help to do research and figure things out about these pollinators. So this Native Bee Watch is a CSU extension program out of Arapahoe County. I think some of you on the call did participate in Native Bee Watch this year. I do think the registration is closed for 2020, but you can get on a list for 2021. So what you do is you get trained in identifying native bees, and then you just commit to going out a few times during the season and logging which bees are on your flowers. And it helps to get an idea of how these populations are doing, what bees are where, and it's a really cool project to get involved in. So you'll have this slide with the web page and all that, but just know that there are ways you can get involved here. I'm going to take a quick sharing break so that I can look at the chats and see if there are questions that I can answer. All right. If you have a hive of honeybees, will they outcompete native bees? That's a good question. Maybe. If the resources are limited and there's only so much and you have a ton, the honeybees are social, so there's going to be a lot of them in one area. So it could be. Yep. What can be done to prevent predators such as skunks from digging up ground hives? Another really good question. There's trapping, there are repellents that you can use around the border of your property. Hound dogs do a pretty good job. No, that's kind of a joke, but really they do. So just anything you can do to kind of scare those large mammal predators away would be good. If you make a bee habitat with holes drilled out, do they survive outside in the winter, or do you have to take them outside? Great question. You can leave them outside. That's why the nests are lined. They have been, insulated for the winter, and they will be just fine to stay outside. Is there any way to prevent spread of disease from honeybee hives to native hives? If you are somebody who is a beekeeper, just keeping an eye on your hives, making sure if you have a disease that you're handling it right away would kind of be the best thing that you could do, and one of the only things that we could really do. think that's it for now. Let me get back to my presentation. I'm going to grab a drink because I've been talking very loudly in here. Okay, let's switch gears to hummingbirds. How much fun is a hummingbird? So why are hummingbirds important? Many plants depend solely on hummingbirds for not only pollination, but seed dispersal. The birds may eat the seeds, whether it's through a fruit or something like that, and then disperse them as they fly along. So that's huge to a lot of plants. And then, of course, they also pollinate as they visit the flowers and drink the nectar, as this bird here is doing. A lot of these plants would likely become extinct if it wasn't for the hummingbirds disseminating their seeds and pollinating them. They also feed on insects, though, which is important. You know, we want some of these insects to be reduced in their populations, particularly mosquitoes and things like that. So hummingbirds help out in that way. And is it not just thrilling to see a hummingbird in your yard? That's important too. They make us happy. 10% of all hummingbirds are actually threatened with extinction right now, and that's worldwide. Actually, the species that live in, or that are North American species, are the most well off. It's kind of the Central and South American species that are really hurting right now. And the endangered hummingbird species are mainly experiencing the conversion of their natural habitats into agricultural land in Central and South America. So that's the big thing right now for those Southern America birds and what's really harming them. The anatomy of a hummingbird, they have those long, slender bills that they use to go into those long-shaped flowers and drink nectar. They have very porous, or actually in some cases even hollow bones, so they're very light. Their brain is 4.2% of their body weight. That's the largest percentage in the animal kingdom. So by weight, they have the largest brains. That's very, very interesting. Their normal body temperature is 105 degrees Fahrenheit. When they sleep, it drops to 70 degrees. So they can really drop it down a lot. And these birds are temperamental. They will fight with each other. They will absolutely compete at a hummingbird feeder. If you have one, you've probably seen it. I was reading a blog written by another horticulture agent in Colorado, and she said that if the hummingbirds could speak English, they would definitely be cursing. That's kind of their temperament. They're just kind of angry. So like I said, many flowers have evolved to have hummingbirds visit them. So normally they have these long tubular shapes. They're bright red, bright pink, very brightly colored, weakly scented. The position of the flower is important. You can see in the top picture here, that flower is positioned just so that hummingbird can fly right up and drink nectar. The hummingbirds are out during the day, so the flowers need to be open during the day, and they're going to visit flowers that produce a lot of nectar. It takes a ton of energy to flap those wings as fast as they do, so they need a lot of nectar to keep their energy up. And they're frequent feeders, which makes them great pollinators. They're always visiting flowers. So their pollination strategies are simple disruptions. So they're drinking nectar and they just kind of bump the flower around, cause pollen to fall, and that's how they pollinate. It could be bill transfer. So in the bottom picture, this hummingbird might get some pollen on its bill and then go to another flower and pollinate that way. And in the top picture, this is an example of head transfer. So the anthers of that top flower are, you can see them almost right on that little hummingbird's head. It's going to deposit some pollen on its head, and then when it goes to another flower, the flower parts will be touching its head again, and that's how it will pollinate. So that's kind of cool. Hummingbirds in Colorado. Interestingly enough, hummingbirds are only found in the Western Hemisphere. People in the Eastern Hemisphere don't have hummingbirds. So that's kind of cool. Most hummingbirds live in Central and South America. 26 species will visit the United States for at least part of the year, and 17 species breed somewhere in the United States. In Colorado, we only have 4 species that can be commonly observed. So let's go over those 4 species. This is the broad-tailed hummingbird. In its range, it's very common and widespread. There have been some concerns with declining populations in recent years. They breed in the mountains, but they will make stops in lower elevations, especially kind of on their way to the mountains earlier in the season. They're common on the western slope of the state. So this isn't one that over here in Pueblo, which we're kind of in the southeastern part of Colorado, we don't really see too many broad-tailed hummingbirds as much as they do on the western slope. So they eat nectar, of course, they eat insects, of course, and they will absolutely visit a feeder. This is the rufous hummingbird. It has the longest documented migration of any bird, almost 4,000 miles one way. They go from Mexico to Alaska. That's a long migration. The common and widespread, but just like the broad-tailed that have been seeing some decline. They're migrants in Colorado. We'll see them at our lower elevations in the spring, and we'll see them in mountain meadows in the summer and fall. They also will visit your feeders, and they also love to visit penstemon, paintbrush, scarlet sage. If you know your flower shapes, then you'll see there's a common theme here. Those all kind of have a bit of a tubular shaped flower. The black-chinned hummingbird, again, common on the western half of the state, below 6,000 feet. They're typically found in habitats that are at least associated with water in some way. A lot of insects around there and things like that. Their numbers are pretty stable. So this one, as far as populations go, are doing pretty good. And this is the only one that will breed in Colorado. The very southwestern corner of Colorado is a part of its breeding range. They'll nest in canyons or riparian areas, like I mentioned. If they are in urban areas, they'll prefer tall trees, flowering shrubs, vines, somewhere with a lot of protection. They arrive in Colorado in April, and they usually leave by September. They feed on nectar and insects, and again, they will visit your feed. This is the Calliope, or the Calliope Hummingbird. Common in its range, but very vulnerable to habitat loss. So this is one that we're keeping our eye on. Can be found in the mountains and at lower elevations. This is actually the smallest bird that will be found in North America. So they're teeny tiny. They'll visit low-growing flowers. So if you have some kind of ground low-growing flowers, they will visit those. Again, of course, they eat insects, and they will absolutely visit feeders. Pretty common migrating in a lot of parts of Colorado. So let's talk a little bit about migration. It's not well documented. They've tried to do some banding, but I mean, try to catch a hummingbird. It's not easy. They're fast and they're mean. So it's not well documented, but we do have some data. All species have different migration paths and times. Most hummingbirds spend the winter in Mexico or Central America and start their migration north around February. So we start to see them in Colorado around April normally, especially at the lower elevations around April. The males are usually first to arrive. What triggers them to start their migration? Of course, it's instinct coupled with day length. They can tell that the length of the day is changing, and that will trigger them that it's time for them to move north. Before they make the trip, they'll gain 25 to 40% of their body weight so that they have tons of energy and fat stores to burn off during the long trip. And of course, they'll stop along the way to eat and rest. We're at a lower elevation here in Pueblo, so they're kind of just stopping on their way to the mountains when we see them here. This is a cool picture over here. These are approximate, of course, but these are breeding ranges of some of the major hummingbird species in North America. So you can see over on the east, if anybody here is from the east, I think we did have some people, you have the ruby-throated hummingbird breeding all around in the east. You'll see the black chin just kind of barely touches the southwestern tip of Colorado, and then the rufous and the Anna's hummingbirds are also shown there. I love this map, and I wanted to show you it. I pulled it for Colorado, but you can get onto hummingbirdcentral.com and look at your area if you're not from Colorado. And this is from last year, I believe. So there may be more updated data even for Colorado. But it's so cool. It's a map from a citizen science project of people who spotted certain species of hummingbirds in your area. So here's Pueblo, Colorado, where I am right now. You can see that the only species spotted here was the black chin hummingbird. But you can see that the broad-tailed is super common on the Front Range. And then it looks like some ruby-throated in the north as well have been observed. So that was really interesting to me. Hummingbirdcentral.com, and you'll get these slides, like I said. So hummingbird habitats, the hummingbirds, like we've been talking about, they're migratory. They need suitable habitat along their migration routes so they can, you know, breed, nest, overwinter. They need protected habitat. Utility corridors, field edges, and suitable home landscapes are very helpful. So if you have somewhere where they can stop, that's great. An abundance of flowers that they like is most important, and then somewhere safe for them to rest. Pesticides can harm the birds, and also they eat insects. So if you're killing off all the insects, that kind of takes away their food source. If you can encourage your neighbors and those around you to also create hummingbird habitat, that's very helpful, because if they have, you know, a whole block of suitable habitat, they're much more likely to stop and rest than if there's just one yard. Let's talk about some of the threats to hummingbirds. I love this picture. This praying mantis is just like scaring the tarnation out of this hummingbird. But there are a lot of threats. Habitat loss, changes in the distribution of their plants, which, you know, definitely could be due to climate change. A lot of the distributions of plants are moving north as the climate starts to warm, and some of the hummingbirds don't go that far north. So that is harmful to them, absolutely. Hummingbirds at Home is an Audubon project that's kind of assessing that, how climate change is affecting those populations, and I'll show you more about that here in a second. Invasive plants, non-native plants, crowding out natives is harmful. Here's one of the biggest harms: stray cats, or, you know, your own cat. Cats kill hummingbirds all the time. They will catch them. They're small enough for the cat to catch, so, you know, I don't know what you can really do about that. try to keep the stray cats away, or keep your hummingbird feeders somewhere where your cat can't get to them. Speaking of feeders, dirty feeders that become infected with different funguses and stuff can kill a hummingbird. And then hot feeders. If you have your feeder where it's getting blasted with sun all day, and then if a hummingbird takes a drink, that can absolutely kill them if that solution is too hot. So you need to try to keep your feeder somewhere that's more shady and more cool. And then if a hummingbird becomes trapped, you know, in your garage or something like that, they can die from becoming too worn out, because obviously they're going to freak out. They're going to be flying all around, and that can kill them too. So that's another threat. So we talked about food a little already. The nectar gives them energy. They can drink up to 2 times their body weight per day. So they're drinking a lot of nectar. They'll drink sap from holes made by woodpeckers, and then their protein comes from insects that they catch on the fly. They usually get enough water from nectar, but they are attracted to like bird baths and fountains and misters and things like that, just to kind of cool down, take a little bath. And also there tends to be insects around standing water, so they'll be able to catch some insects there as well. Feeders absolutely are helpful to populations, especially if they're being affected by loss of forage and loss of habitat. Like I said, place it in a shady area, away from predators, aka cats, and other mammals that might be birds. And this is another big thing that I wanted to stress. The colored nectar is absolutely not necessary, and is actually, some studies are finding, maybe harmful, because it has those artificial dyes in it. So a clear nectar is fine. You already have the red on the feeder usually to attract them. You don't need the red nectar. And you could actually just make a sugar water solution on your stove, cool it down. That's perfectly fine to put in your feeder. Avoid honey, avoid artificial sweeteners, try to avoid the dye. Clean it frequently to prevent any kind of fungal or bacterial growth that could harm the birds. And again, I'm just going to kind of run through these real quick, just some ideas. You'll have these slides to look back at. But bee balm is a good one for the hummingbirds. This is one that will transfer pollen to the top, to their heads. Cardinal flower. Actually, insects have a hard time with cardinal flower, so the hummingbirds are very important to this plant, and they will definitely, it's so bright red, it's perfect for a hummingbird. Columbines, Colorado state flower, of course, they prefer the red varieties. As you know, if you grow columbines, they will hybridize, so good luck keeping them red if you have other colors around. Larkspur, all varieties are great. Again, you can see those kind of tubular flowers. Beard tongue, aka the penstemon. There's a ton of different varieties that can grow at, you know, plains to the mountains. They do so great in Colorado. Everybody should have a penstemon in their Colorado garden. Coneflower, this one's easy to find. I mean, you can find echinacea anywhere, and that's a great one. Honeysuckle is a good one, a nice tubular shaped flower, again. Sage, any kind of the sage or salvia flowers would be great for the hummingbirds. Okay, now our fun facts. So they actually can fly nonstop 18 to 22 hours when migrating. That's crazy, that's a long time. There is a hummingbird called the Bee Hummingbird that weighs only 2 grams. It's the smallest living bird in the whole world. Their hearts beat up to 1,260 beats per minute. That's a lot. But when they are kind of in cold temperatures, they go into something called torpor, and they can drop their body temperatures. And when they're in torpor, they can go down to 50 beats per minute. That's a huge drop. They are the only bird that can fly backwards. Kind of cool. And their wings flap 20 to 80 times per minute. So you can see why they need a lot of nectars for a lot of energy. And here's your citizen science projects that you can get involved with for hummingbirds. We already kind of mentioned hummingbirds at home. This is data that's being collected on how they're interacting with different flowers. So we can try to understand the mismatch between flowering times and the arrival of hummingbirds in these breeding areas related to climate change. So this is something that you know, is very helpful for people to be out reporting data, so we can try to get an idea on what's going on. Feeder watch. This is ask people with feeders to periodically count the birds they see at their feeders. Kind of helps with distribution and population data. And then eBird is a project out of Cornell, who, you know, they're huge on ornithology. Kind of just basic information on abundance distribution, things like that. So those are things that you can kind of Google and check out if you want to get involved. And then I wanted to give you another inspiration. Of course, you can buy hummingbird feeders. There's tons of them. You can buy at any garden center, any hardware store. But here's a DIY. You can buy the little stopper on Amazon. And then you have an old wine bottle. You stick the stopper in there once you filled it with your sugar water solution. And then the wire is just like a heavy gauge copper wire. And you have a DIY, I think, super cute hummingbird feeder that you can hang in your pollinator garden. Okay, so that's hummingbirds. Let me take a minute to check the chat really quick. Pull up the chat. Sorry. Okay, apparently in Australia, cat owners are required to keep their cats inside. I didn't know, and I'm not a cat person, so I wouldn't really, why not though? I mean, I do like that they take the mice, but how frequently do you clean feeders? You know, it kind of depends on your feeder and your site. I would say definitely every time you fill it, give it a good clean. So that is the chat. I'm going to take another quick water break. And this is our last pollinator that we're talking about, butterflies. So butterflies are important, just like all the pollinators. We have somewhere between 12,000 and 15,000 species worldwide. In North America, there's 750 species. I think that everyone on this Zoom will agree that there's just an intrinsic and aesthetic value. I mean, I don't think anybody out there sees a butterfly and is like, ew, a butterfly. No, they're so pretty and you just love to see them fluttering in your yard. An abundance of butterflies is usually an indicator of a thriving ecosystem. So that's something that scientists often use to kind of assess how an ecosystem is doing. They're important to the food chain as predators and as prey, as particularly the caterpillars. They're very sensitive to changing climate. So this is another way scientists can use them as indicators of things that are changing. And they're a model species for many scientific fields. Mimicry, which we'll talk about a little bit, evolution, genetics, population dynamics. Butterflies are often used as kind of the example species in these kinds of studies. 27 US species of butterflies are labeled by Xerces Society as being critically imperiled. So that means they're not quite endangered, but they're kind of on their way. The monarch has gotten a lot of attention in recent years. I mean, everybody's heard of the monarch butterfly. The Fish and Wildlife Service actually petitioned for the monarch to be on the endangered species list. They petitioned for that in 2014. It was found that there is reasonable concern that the monarch should be on the endangered species list. So they had to do a lot of studies to see if they really need to be on the list. And actually, the decision is due in December of 2020, so just a few more months until we should be hearing if the monarch is going to be added to the endangered species list. And I was wondering if COVID would have an effect on that deadline, and I tried to do a little research, and as far as I can tell, they're still on track to make that decision by December of 2020. So be looking out for that. The Xerces Society obviously is a huge advocate for butterflies and insects. They have a plan that I very vaguely laid it out here, but you can read more on their website. But they do have a plan to protect Western monarchs. So their plan is kind of five-pronged here: protect overwintering sites in California, restore breeding habitat in California, protect all habitats from pesticides, protect summer breeding and fall migration habitat outside of California, and then just to do more research to figure out what's going on with the monarchs and what they can do. So that is good that somebody is paying attention. And California is one of their biggest spring and summer breeding areas, so that's why it's mainly a lot of their efforts are focused there. Butterfly, oh, that picture came out a little blurrier than I hoped, but this is kind of a little butterfly anatomy. They have a forewing and a hindwing. Of course, they have a head which has antenna and the compound eyes, and then the proboscis is their little tongue. They have legs, and then the thorax and abdomen, just like most insects have. Now, of course, we know butterflies are only one part of the equation. They have their larva, which is a caterpillar. So here's caterpillar anatomy. I don't know, a little more boring, but I guess still good. They have the thorax and the abdomen. The antennae are called tentacles on the caterpillar. They have true legs that are on the thorax, and then the legs on the abdomen are called prolegs. Just kind of some little tidbit of anatomy info. Butterflies have such a fascinating life cycle. I mean, kids learn this from a very young age. It's just fascinating. Their life cycle, they go through a complete metamorphosis. They completely change what they look like from a caterpillar to a butterfly. Metamorphosis can take anywhere from 1 month to 1 year. So it depends on the species. And each stage of their life cycle has a different goal. So we'll start at egg. Egg is kind of the first stage of the butterfly life cycle. So usually a female butterfly is going to lay an egg on the surface of a leaf that the larva, the caterpillar, will want to eat once they hatch. So Those are called the host plants for the caterpillar. That's what the females are looking for to lay their eggs. The egg hatches and becomes the larva, aka the caterpillar. And all the caterpillar does is eat. They just want to grow fast, so they eat and eat and eat. And if you're familiar with the children's story, The Very Hungry Caterpillar, you know that that's what they do. They might not be eating chocolate cake like they do in the story, but they're eating just lots and lots of leaves. And then next comes the pupa or the chrysalis. This is the cocoon where the caterpillar is wrapped up in this structure and becoming a butterfly. They will emerge from the chrysalis and then they are the adults. The adult stage is the butterfly, and their main goal is to mate and lay eggs. So butterflies are absolutely pollinators. Here's kind of your checklist for your butterfly flowers. Red, yellow, and orange are the colors you want to look for. Open during the day when the butterflies are out. Deep, plentiful nectar, and nectar guides. So on some petals of flowers, I should have put a better picture here, but they'll have a kind of like a different colored section on the inner petal to kind of show the butterfly, like right in here is where you can find the nectar. So that would be a nectar guide. And then they like clusters so that they have kind of a landing pad to land on and be able to take a little break and drink some nectar. They have very good vision, but a weak sense of smell. So it doesn't really matter how fragrant a flower is to a butterfly. And unlike these, they can see red. So they like those red, yellow, oranges. Here's some of our butterflies that we'll see in Colorado, some of the most common ones. This is the black swallowtail, and I've included pictures of the adult and the larva, so you can notice their caterpillars as well. They're flying from April to September. The caterpillar eats dill, parsley, fennel, carrot. If you have grown parsley outside in your garden in Colorado, then you've probably seen a black swallowtail caterpillar because they will just demolish them. The adults are going to visit butterfly weed, alfalfa, and thistle. This is the two-tailed swallowtail. They're flying April to August, so they'll start doing their cocoon soon. Their caterpillars eat green ash and chokecherry, so that's where they'll lay their eggs. This is the weirdest looking caterpillar. I think this caterpillar is so strange looking. But the adults visit geranium, thistle, and milkweed. Monarchs, of course, they're flying June to October, so they're kind of out more in the fall. The caterpillars pretty much exclusively eat milkweed. That's why if you have a garden and you can grow some milkweed, that's great. And the sap of the milkweed is toxic, and that makes the caterpillar and the adult distasteful to predators. That's kind of a part of their game. They're able to eat that milkweed, and then other things don't eat them. Now this is where mimicry comes in. There's a lot of species of butterflies that look just like monarchs, but they do not eat milkweed, and they are not toxic. That's mimicry. They're tricking predators to think, oh, that's a poisonous monarch, I better not eat it, when actually it's not. Adults will visit cosmos, Canada thistle, and rabbit rush. A little bit more info about monarchs because they're kind of special. In the fall, they'll travel thousands of miles to fir forests in Mexico or eucalyptus groves in California. That's where they typically overwinter. They cling to the branches in these huge congregations that you can kind of see in these pictures here, just tons and tons and tons of monarchs. In March, they head north and they lay their eggs on milkweed along the way. This is the morning cloak. I think it's really beautiful, and the caterpillar is very interesting looking. It flies February to November, so it has a very long range of flying. The caterpillars eat willow, aspen, cottonwood, and elm, so you'll mostly see this on trees. The adults will visit rabbit brush, milkweed, and they'll also, if there's a tree that is kind of sapping from the trunk, they'll visit that as well. This is clouded sulfur, flies April to November. The caterpillars eat alfalfa and clover. Adults are gonna visit alfalfa, phlox, rabbit brush, asters, and marigolds. Variegated fritillary is our next Colorado butterfly. It flies April to October. Caterpillars eat a lot of different plants. Pansies seem to be one of their favorites. And the adults visit rabbitbrush and Canada thistle. So you can see that rabbitbrush is really pulling some heavy duty when it comes to pollinators. A lot of pollinators are going to visit rabbitbrush. So threats to butterflies, just like with everything else, human development in their migration paths and in their habitats is obviously very harmful. A lot of butterflies will only fly low, and they can't fly over high walls. So that's something to keep in mind. Plant distributions, like I already mentioned, are moving north as the climate warms, which makes for longer migrations or possibly remove some of those plants from the butterflies' zones that they might be found in. So food for caterpillars is going to be the host plants, and for adults is going to be, nectar. So find out what are host plants for the caterpillars in your area. That'll help you to establish some native populations. The adults, of course, are probably going to fly away, but that'll definitely still help you to help their populations. Adult butterflies eat nectar from the flowers. They also may feed on honeydew from aphids, tree sap, rotting fruit, and bird droppings. So those are all of the things that the butterflies might kind of feed on. Butterfly habitats. This is an important one to talk about, and I actually kind of just learned this. If you took this class in person last year, I'm so sorry that we made butterfly houses. I've just been reading the research that is not good. So let's talk more about that. The main thing that you can really do as far as habitat goes is to just have the right host plants for the caterpillars and butterfly attracting plants. And of course, reduce or eliminate pesticides. It's always good to have a water source. If you have a bird bath or something like that, maybe put a few stones in it so that the butterflies have somewhere to land and they can kind of take a little break in your bird bath. Shelter is kind of just going to be on those plants. From spring to early fall, they're going to sleep in tall, undisturbed plantings. Some species do overwinter as adults, and that was the thinking behind butterfly houses. A lot of people will put these butterfly houses in their landscapes to give the overwintering adults a place to overwinter. Okay, so the entomologist from CSU, Dr. Cranshaw, has sent out an email a while back saying, not only are they not really helpful, like the butterflies don't really use them to overwinter, but they're actually harmful to the butterflies. So for one, very few species overwinter as adults, so it's not really helping out the majority. For two, it's much more likely that the only thing that's going to be using these butterfly houses to nest are wasps. And wasps will absolutely demolish caterpillars. They are carnivores, they will eat caterpillars. And so if an adult butterfly enters and you have this wasp nest, they're done for, they're trapped. So we're actually just creating like these death traps for butterflies when we use these. They're not recommended. The research shows that they're not helpful and actually harmful. So we will just start to hopefully spread the knowledge that we're not going to put out butterfly houses. So butterflies will pass through, they'll get drinks of nectar. You can help them stay a little bit longer by providing adequate flowers. Windbreaks, open sunny areas are good. Adult males are attracted to mud around puddles of water. It's thought that this provides dissolved minerals that they need for their health. Females search for plants that host their caterpillars. They will lay their eggs on those host plants, so providing those is critical. And then plant flowers that are blooming for a long period of time. Usually summertime is when the butterflies are most active. Summer, maybe early fall. And again, I'll just run through, again, asters, again, we have those on a different slide, I think, for bees. So asters are gonna pull double duty for the pollinators. So bee balm is another one that will go for the bees and for the butterflies. Butterfly bush, of course, They'll prefer the varieties that are lavender and pink, so keep that in mind. Cosmos, I just love a classic Cosmo. That has a nice big landing pad for a butterfly. Blanket flower, another one of my favorites. Obviously, I'm the one who made the presentation, but beautiful flower, nice big landing pad for a butterfly to land on. And lilacs will absolutely attract some butterflies, and they're early bloomers, so that's a good one. Marigolds. I mean, if you can't grow a marigold, I don't know if you can grow any flower. They're so easy, so drought tolerant, so heat tolerant, tolerant of any soil, so that's an easy one. Rabbit brush, again, we already had this one in a different slide. That's a great, this is just a great pollinator plant, especially around southern Colorado. Sweet peas. The butterflies love sweet peas, and they're so beautiful. There are some common conflicts when it comes to the butterflies, particularly actually for the caterpillars. Some plants that are attracted to butterflies are considered to be weeds. So we talked about this with the bees, but thistles, dandelions, we might be wanting to get rid of them, but the butterflies would prefer if we kept them. Well-manicured and tended gardens are kind of typically unattractive to a butterfly. So kind of a messy natural garden is what they're looking for. It's good for me too. Of course, you do want to check for noxious weeds. You don't want to be growing noxious weeds, but you know, sometimes maybe slack off on weeding a little bit. It'll be good. Now, here's the big thing. Certain caterpillars develop on garden crops and will totally destroy them. I mean, I can't grow parsley outside where I live. They will be eaten by a caterpillar in one day. Broccoli, cabbage, different herbs like parsley and dill are very attractive to caterpillars. One method that you can try is to have your garden, your herb garden, where you're growing things for yourself, but then to also have another little area where you have herbs growing for the caterpillars. Then if the caterpillar ends up in your herb garden, you can simply pick it off, put it in the other garden. It's not going to leave. It has perfectly good food over there. So that's a good method to try if it doesn't involve using any insecticides or anything like that. And then here are some citizen science projects you can get involved with. Tons of them revolve around monarchs. The Forest Service has like I think 4 or 5 different citizen science projects that revolve around monarchs. Some are monitoring caterpillars, some are monitoring adults. So you can go to their website and check that out. Also, the Butterfly Pavilion in Colorado has this butterfly monitoring network that started in 2013. That's again just kind of monitoring and entering data into an app. So you can help to kind of figure out what's going on with these populations by getting involved in these citizen science. All right, and I just want to encourage you, I'm going to check the chat here for some final questions, but if you have any questions, whether you're from Pueblo, Colorado, or wherever you're from, feel free to shoot me an email. That's my email address right there. Jot it down. You'll be getting these slides, so you'll have it. And let me check the chat, and then I would greatly appreciate if anybody would stick around to take the short poll that I have for you. Pull up the chat here. If emerald ash borer kills a lot of ash trees, will it be bad for the two-tailed swallowtail? Absolutely. Yeah, that's one of their host plants. So it's the emerald ash borer is not only killing a lot of our ash trees in Colorado, but taking away an important plant for the swallowtail. Yep, that's definitely a concern. Can you still eat a cabbage that has cabbage butterfly damage? I've had luck netting my cabbages. If they can't get in, they can't lay eggs. Also keep squirrels from eating them. That's brilliant. Squirrels are my main garden pest. I might have to try netting. Yes, you know, if the damage, if you start to see like molding or some kind of like fungus growing, I wouldn't eat it. But if it's slight damage and, you know, of course we're washing our produce, I think it would still be fine to eat that cabbage. Absolutely.